There's a solitary, humble wooden structure on a windswept hill in rural New England. To open the door is to engage our minds, our hearts, and our imaginations. In this place, preachers and professors, past and present, come alive as they walk the aisle, ascend the pulpit stairs, and teach. From theology, from history, and from the Word of God. Welcome to the Saybrook Meetinghouse, an audio production of Saybrook Ministries.
Names that you don't recognize, terms that you don't understand, times that are hard to imagine. Those are things you are going to encounter today, and I ask you to stretch your mind a little bit as you enter this week's Saybrook Meetinghouse podcast. This is Ben Keller, and I'll be reading from The Rise of the Old Dissent, exemplified in the life of Oliver Heywood, who lived from 1630 to 1702. And this is a book by the Reverend Joseph Hunter, written in 1842. So already, the 1840s, there's going to be much that is unfamiliar to us. And it's going to be doubly unfamiliar because the gentleman, Joseph Hunter, from the 1840s, is going to take us further back into the 17th century. But I would ask you to be patient and listen and endure some of the terms and concepts that you're not familiar with as you hear the education and the development and the life story excerpt of Oliver Heywood from the Puritan generation. In many ways, his education and his piety and the growth of his Christian life and character were emblematic of the Puritan generation. So I would ask you to hang in there to a podcast that perhaps is a little more difficult than usual, especially hang in there until you get to the end where you're going to hear about Mr. Samuel Hammond. And you'll see the dramatic impact that Samuel Hammond has on the life of Oliver Heywood, not only Heywood, but many, many others. So sit back, listen, enjoy, and let's go back in time and see what we can learn from the life of Oliver Heywood. The effects of such an education as Mr. Heywood received were very early manifest in anxious solicitude respecting his own state of acceptance with God. Speaking of the period of his life before he went to Cambridge, and apparently before he had reached his 15th year, he says, quote, "How often did I think my state in some respects to be worse than that of birds and beasts, trees, or stones? Because by sin I am subject to eternal misery, of which they are incapable. Sometimes I dare not pray, lest I should take God's name in vain. And then by fits I had my inward troubles, fears, and doubts." Unquote. He expatiates on this, his state of mind, in somewhat oratorical a manner, and it is needless to transcribe the whole, but the conclusion at which he arrives is of some importance to the right understanding of his character and history, namely, that there was no period of his life on which he was able to fix and to say that then, in that very week or month, the work of conversion was completed in him. And when later he reflected on this period of his religious history, he says that he came to the same conclusion at which Baxter also arrived, quote, "that God doth often make use of a religious education by natural parents as a means of first begetting converting grace. And that if parents were faithful and skillful in those relative duties, God would own that work to so great an end, and that public preaching of the word should be the more usual means of confirmation than conversion, unquote. At the age of 14, he began to receive the Lord's Supper in his parish church, and about the same time he entered into a small society of young men who were accustomed to meet together once a fortnight for religious conversation and prayer. It would seem from the account which has now been given as if nothing were attended to in the education bestowed on Mr. Heywood except the cultivation of the religious principle, but this was far from being the case. No doubt in the families of the Puritans, the first and principal object of the parent was to create in the minds of children a deep and awful sense of the relation in which we stand to our Creator and the responsibilities under which we receive the gift of life. And this was much more an object and a business with them than in families less in earnest about these affairs, or more solicitous about the things of time. But wherever the means were afforded of receiving the benefits of a good education of another kind, they were not backward to avail themselves of them. So that some of the best scholars of the time came from the Puritan families, especially those learned in the writings of ancient and modern Christian divines. But where the destination was to the ministry, great pains were always bestowed on the cultivation of the intellectual powers, and on giving that instruction which should enable the future minister to read the sacred writings, pure as they are delivered down to us, as well as the writings of the early fathers of the Church. No mistake is greater than to suppose that when we speak of the Puritan minister, we mean one who had zeal and piety without any tincture of learning. Their writings sufficiently prove the contrary. Only their learning was less prominent than their devotion and zeal. Mr. Heywood manifested at a very early period of his life what his parents interpreted into an inclination for the office of minister, and a presage of his success in that honorable character. I pass over a childish story or two in which this inclination was supposed to be indicated, but what he relates of himself may be worthy preservation, that from the very earliest period to which his memory could ascend, he had had a very reverent esteem of the ministry and those in it. As these indications coincided with the secret wishes of his parents, and especially of his mother, it was very early determined to prepare him for the ministry. And they sought out for him the best instruction which those parts of the country at that time afforded. But this, according to Mr. Heywood's own account, was not of the best quality. He was for a time at the public school at Bolton. He was also a pupil of Mr. Rathband, who had undertaken to instruct youth when he was suspended from the ministry by his diocesan. He was under the care of other tutors, for he tells us that he was, quote, very much slowed in his learning by change of school and variety of masters, and the negligence of some of them, unquote. Nor was it till his family had found out a certain Mr. Rudel, who lived somewhere in the wild country about Horwich, that he found himself in a position in which his own application and diligence were wisely seconded and directed. He profited more, he says, under this master in 1 year than he had done in 4 elsewhere. His brother Nathaniel, 3 years and a half younger than himself, who was also destined for the university and the ministry, was under the same schoolmaster. I wish we could recover something more respecting him. It is evident that he was a useful and valuable man. It was here that Mr. Heywood must have laid that excellent foundation of grammar learning, which enabled him to speak and write the Latin language with fluency, if not with elegance, and that he must have read several of those ancient authors with whom we find him afterwards familiar. Mr. Heywood has given no account of the method pursued by his schoolmaster, or of the particular books which were placed in his hands. The curriculum was probably in no respect different from that of other schools of the time in which grammar learning was taught. But as this is a subject which seems now but imperfectly understood, I shall transcribe the account which another Lancashire minister, a friend of Mr. Heywood, has given of his own school education in that county at St. Helens and Rainsford. Quote, "He received me when I was learning as in Presenti and Cato, and instructed me in prose, in Corderius, Aesop's Fables, Tully's Offices, Epistles, and Orations, together with Aphthonius for Latin in prose, and the Greek grammar of Camden first, and Clenard afterwards, together with a Greek catechism, and lastly the Greek Testament. For I proceeded no further with him, and for poetry in Mantuan, Terence, Ovid's Epistles and Metamorphoses, Virgil, and Horace. The rhetorics he read to us were Susan Broadus first, and Tallius afterwards. My exercises were usually a piece of Latin, of which he himself dictated the English every day of the week, save Thursdays and Saturdays, and besides, somewhat weakly, as I rose in ability, first, dialogues in imitation of Corderius, then an epistle, in which I was to follow Cicero, though, alas, at a great distance, then themes, as we called them, in the way of Aphthonius, consisting of many parts, and taking up one side of half a sheet pretty thickly written, and, towards the latter end, good store of verses, most hexameters and pentameters, but some sapphics and alcaics, all that were presumed by their standing able to discourse in Latin were under a penalty if they either spoke English or violated grammatical rules. But barbarous language, if not incongruous for grammar, had no punishment but derision. These were the orders we were subject to at teaching hours." Unquote. I am not acquainted with any account equally particular with this of the mode pursued in schools in the reign of Charles I, and am tempted to extend the notice which we have of the same person's studies when transferred to another master. Quote, "A new schoolmaster came to Rainsford that had the name of a very civil man and good teacher, and that not without cause. I confess as to great eminence of natural parts, and diligence in looking to our souls. I thought him inferior to his predecessor, and it was no small prejudice to me that the popish gentry in the neighborhood were so fond of him. Yet I believe he was a Protestant, and it was only his being a great anti-Puritan, which that place never had before, that probably was the reason they so highly valued him. Whatever was his opinion, he was eminently able and diligent master. He had been brought up not only in a good school in Bolton, but after, at the university, a good season, I have heard 5 years, where, having a great affection to the Greek tongue, and opportunity to hear the public professor, and to converse with other men, he had attained to a marvelous exactness in pronouncing it in the university manner, which till then I had not heard of. He was also skillful in the derivations of words, teaching us many that we could not find in any lexicon. Nor was he slight in examining us about the dialects not only in poets, but even in the Greek Testament, wherein he made us observe the Hebraisms, Latinisms, and idioms. He taught us also to make Greek exercises in prose and verse, and both in them and what we made in Latin he expected not only congruity, but elegancy. He spoke very good Latin to us in a constant way, put us to take out our lessons ourselves, and in examining them, he stood not so much upon parsing, as they called it, or scanning of verses and proving them, to which he found us well inured, as upon rhetorical tropes and figures. To fit us whereunto, he removed us out of Tallius into Farnaby, laughing at Susan Brodus as an old dull piece, which called the tropes as well as the scheme by the name of figures. He was also very notable at teaching us to observe all allusions in profane authors to the sacred scriptures, insomuch that anything leaning that way should hardly pass his observation. I remember very well, when we were upon the story of Deucalion's flood in Ovid's Metamorphoses, he took notice of these words, ubi nuper erurat, as thinking it a strange allusion, whether intended or accidental, to the mountain of Ararat, upon which Noah's ark rested. He took a great deal of pains with me, especially in Homer's Odyssey." Unquote. Through such a course as this, Mr. Heywood passed, and it is evident that thus an excellent foundation would be laid for the studies of the university. On the 9th of July, 1647, he was admitted to Trinity College, Cambridge, and immediately went to reside. When his father took leave of him, he left with him 6 special admonitions. First, to humble himself frequently before God, and to do so at least every morning and evening. Second, to read the Scriptures diligently. Third, to keep a written record of his private meditations. Fourth, to take notes of the sermons which he heard. Fifth, to keep steadily in view the thought how short is life. And sixth, to maintain the just medium between too much solitariness and too much company. The university was at that time exactly what the Puritans wished it to be, for the success of the Parliament had enabled the Puritan party to effect great changes both in the church and the universities. The masters and professors, who, however learned and qualified for the offices which they held, did not reach the Puritan standard in point of religion, had been removed from their places, and other persons had succeeded them, who were distinguished as much by piety and religious zeal as by learning and skill in government. Dr. Thomas Hill, the Master of Trinity, had been recently appointed under the authority of Parliament. I find little respecting him in Mr. Heywood's papers, but from other sources we derive the information that he was a person in very high esteem among the most zealous Puritans, a strenuous advocate of Calvinist views of Christian doctrine, a diligent preacher in the chapel of his college, and who expounded the Scriptures there almost daily. One who studied in the college at the same time with Mr. Heywood says, quote, "He learned more of Christ in 1 year from Mr. Hill's plain and precious Christ-advancing preaching than he had all his time before in the country." Unquote. Dr. Hill would sometimes lay his hand upon his breast and say with emphasis, quote, "Every Christian hath something here that will frame an argument against Arminianism." Unquote. He recommended Mr. Akehurst to Mr. Heywood for his tutor. Of this Mr. Akehurst, Mr. Heywood says that, quote, "He was then a flourishing instrument, and was looked upon as the most pious and laborious in all the college." He marks the time because afterwards Mr. Akehurst degenerated, or, as Mr. Heywood says, quote, "grievously apostatized, becoming a common Quaker," unquote. But he retraced his steps and became at last, quote, "a sober physician in Surrey," unquote. On the whole, the pupil was satisfied. Quote, "I must confess he was careful of me, inquired of me what company I was acquainted with, sometimes read lectures to us, prayed with us in his chamber every night, and had sometimes about 30 pupils, and, as I thought, was a gracious Christian. Though I have often taken notice of his inconstancy, and being singular in differing from grave and sober divines, and pride, which was too visible in his apparel, gesture, and other outward tokens thereof." Unquote. Mr. William Burchell, at that time servant to the college master, was the person who led Mr. Heywood to the selection of this college. He was afterwards a non-conforming minister. Mr. Heywood gives no particular account of the course of study pursued in his time at the university. It is natural in a writer of self-biography to pass over that which is common to many and familiarly known to his contemporaries. But by this means, we, in a remote generation, lose what would be valuable information, when the change of manners or the advancement of knowledge has brought about many alterations, so that the old modes, so far from being familiar and known, is impossible to perfectly recover. Only 2 books have descended among Mr. Heywood's manuscript remains, which can be regarded as books of college exercises or college amusements. One is a large abstract of that really good and useful book, the Itinerarium Totius Sacra Scriptura, of that almost forgotten writer, Henry Bunting. This manuscript is of more than 250 pages of close writing in his minute penmanship. The exercise was good, as giving a distinctness and exactness to his knowledge of sacred history. The other is of a lighter character. It consists of, first, a kind of theological commonplace book, and second, a complete transcript of the Horae Vivicae of John Hall, the youthful poet of St. John's, first published the year before Mr. Heywood went to the university. Third, the Ancient History of the Septuagint by J. Doane. Fourth, Selected and Choice Observations Concerning the 12 First Caesars by Edward Lay. Fifth, Some Few Choice Observations collected out of The Mirror That Flatters Not by Le Sueur de la Serre. And sixth, Some Observations gathered out of Howell's Epistles. But we have no notes of lectures, nor any information of the nature of the theological lectures, or of those in philosophy, which, however, Mr. Heywood attended, perhaps too indifferently. The principal studies of Cambridge in these times seem to have had no place there in the time of the Commonwealth. We have no traces, at least of anything like science, in anything that remains of Mr. Heywood. He pronounces a censure on himself for not applying more closely to the lectures in philosophy, in which natural philosophy may be included, prizing, as he says, learning above all other exercises, and thinking that he might afterwards have been more useful had he improved his time better therein. He stood for a scholarship and failed. The failure was, however, partly, perhaps principally, owing to a severe illness of 2 months' continuance. What he further relates of himself may, however, have had something to do with his disappointment. Quote, "My time and thoughts were more employed in practical divinity, and experimental truths were more vital to my soul. I preferred Perkins, Bolton, Preston, and Sibbes far above Aristotle, Plato, Magarus, and Wenditon, though I despise no laborious authors in these subservient studies." Unquote. This is a remarkable and highly characteristic acknowledgment, indicative of his future eminence as a preacher to the many. The time has been when the 4 names whom Mr. Heywood thus honorably mentions would at once call up distinct ideas of certain writings left by the men who bore them with their peculiar characteristics and purposes. At present, it may, perhaps without offense, be presumed that they will call up only certain vague notions of treatises in practical divinity which were once read and esteemed, so that it may not be improper to add that they were the men who had succeeded to the practical writers of the unreformed church, and to those who adapted the works of those writers to the use of the Reformed. Men who lived when the Reformation controversy was in some measure over, and when there was a call for works in which the duties of men were explained and enforced on Protestant principles, and the Christian consolations exhibited as the Protestant can exhibit them. Their era is from the middle of the reign of Elizabeth to almost the beginning of the Civil Wars, so that some of these writings were new books when they were so eagerly read by Mr. Heywood. His own writings show how great an influence they had upon his mind. Perkins had been a famous preacher at Cambridge in the reign of Elizabeth. His works, partly controversial and partly experimental, make 3 folio volumes, though his life was short. Bolton was a Lancashire man, a soil fruitful in men of devotional spirit. He studied at Oxford, where he was renowned for his great learning, but his attention was not particularly turned to divinity till he was 34. His most celebrated writings are entitled Directions for Walking with God, Instructions for the Right Comforting of Afflicted Consciences, and The 4 Last Things. Preston was a celebrated tutor and preacher at Cambridge, who seems to have worn himself out in the work, dying in 1628 at the age of 41. Richard Sibbes was also a Cambridge divine, fellow and master of a college and preacher in one of the churches. 26 tracts are attributed to him, of which The Bruised Reed and The Soul's Conflict are remarkable for having the special commendations of Richard Baxter and Isaac Walton, 2 different men, but both admirable in their own way. Walton leaving copies of them in his will to his son and daughter. They are still highly valued by religious minds. But there was at that time at Cambridge a person who had probably a greater influence over Mr. Heywood than any other person living or dead. This was Mr. Samuel Hammond, the preacher at St. Giles. His name occurs in the histories, where we have them, of almost every other divine who studied at Cambridge at the same time with Mr. Heywood. Dr. Calamy says of him that he preached, quote, with that pious zeal, pungency, and Christian experience, that from all parts of the town and from the most distant villages his useful ministry was attended on, and it was crowned with the conversion of some scores, I might have said hundreds, of scholars. It was the general opinion that there was not a more convincing and successful minister at Cambridge from the time of Mr. Perkins than he." Unquote. And with this agrees the testimony of Mr. Heywood. Quote, "I must confess my heart was many times very much affected under the ordinances at St. Giles, and I cannot but with thankfulness acknowledge Mr. Hammond a profitable instrument for much good to my soul. Though the work might be wrought before, yet I am sure that it was much revived, cleared, and many mistakes removed. Oh, with what a frame of spirit have I come from that place! I usually met with a suitable, searching word, and one that warmed my heart." Unquote. Mr. Heywood speaks also of, quote, "the ingenious and gracious scholars with whom he had intimate familiarity, and was much furthered by them in the ways of the Lord." Unquote. With 2 of them he lived in intimate communication and friendship for the remainder of their lives, notwithstanding differences of judgment with them, agreeing, however, in refusing to comply with the terms of conformity proposed after the Restoration. These were Eli Bentley and Thomas Joly. The latter of them was at Trinity College some time before Mr. Heywood. He was from the same neighborhood, being the son of Major James Joly of Droylsden, in the parish of Manchester, who held the obnoxious office of Provost Marshal in the Parliament Army in the county of Lancaster. He soon admitted Mr. Heywood into his confidence and friendship. Mr. Heywood remembered this and alluded to it in a letter written when they were both nearly at the end of their labors. They were born and died nearly at the same time. They were ministers and nonconformists, neighbors and friends, and had the same trials and the same encouragements. In the second year of his residence at Cambridge, Mr. Heywood was joined by his younger brother, Nathaniel, who, being a riper scholar, as having enjoyed at an earlier period the benefit of the instruction of Mr. Rudel, the good schoolmaster, was thought ready for the university more than 2 years earlier in life than Oliver. He was entered at Trinity College on May 4th, 1648. Quote, "At that time," says his brother, "his heart was not seasoned with the principle of saving grace. Though he was religiously educated, united in holy exercises, loved God's people, and was not tainted with gross immorality, yet he had not discerned the evil of sin, the malignity of his nature, or the necessity of Christ, till he was brought under the ministry of Mr. Hammond, through whose plain and powerful preaching his mind became the subject of strong convictions, which cost him many sad thoughts of heart, as well as tears, but ended at last in a genuine conversion, a sincere covenanting with God, and in centering his soul by faith on Jesus Christ." Unquote. Between these two brothers, there was the most complete community of sentiment and action, and the most perfect fraternal union. After studying the usual number of terms, Mr. Heywood took the degree of Bachelor of Arts, and departed from the university in the spring or early in the summer of 1650. He rejoined his family in Lancashire.
Thank you for joining us this week at the Saybrook Meetinghouse. We hope you've been blessed by today's podcast. Saybrook Ministries' mission is to provide didactic and devotional content from the Christian faith delivered to the saints, recovered and refined by the Protestant Reformation. Be sure to visit saybrookministries.org for continually updated Christian content designed to inspire and invigorate our imagination and intellect. Join us next week for another journey to the Saybrook Meetinghouse. Until then, may God bless you.